I'm just going to say a few words of welcome because I feel as if the panel, we've got a brilliant panel here, and Louise, our guest chair, is going to run the whole event. So I've got a nice, easy task today. So I'm just a couple of words of welcome, but also I just wanted to share some thoughts and put the session into some context. I think this is a really interesting and important discussion today. I think the past 12 months, we've seen tremendous change with our retail, leisure, travel, working plans. And I think we'd all recognise that our once full and bustling city centre is very quiet and just a little bit empty at the moment. And alongside the impact of the pandemic, we're seeing city developments, placemaking policy, and all that is bringing additional change to the city centre. I'm sure Paul will touch on this more through the session, but we've got the city centre transformation project, largely driven by transport and the mobility strategy. The George Street transformation, it's going to see George Street pedestrianised, this wonderful boulevard, and interesting to see how retail will develop, as everything seems to be moving east in the city to our very exciting St. James Centre. And also with the growth of online sales, that's further eroding retail in the high street. And, just earlier while we were chatting with the panel, we were remarking on the news of John Lewis in Aberdeen and how devastating that's going to be to Aberdeen city centre. And then we've got Princes Street, once our premier shopping street, our iconic shopping street. It seems in decline. There's a high level of vacancies, and it certainly doesn't have the brands it once attracted in its heyday. So I think, there's a serious rethink of Princes Street. In fact, I had a really interesting chat with Neil Gardner yesterday. He's the convener of the planning committee. And I think there's this whole new kind of holistic approach to the development and the future of Princes Street and the Waverley Valley. And I think there's a real opportunity for us as a business community to feed into that. I sense there's this real openness to engage and for us all to contribute on what that might look like in the future. And then, of course, we've got the emergence of the 20-minute neighbourhoods, which is going to bring significant change ahead, I think. So as the brief said, I don't think that we are all looking to return to the way things were. I certainly see a very, very different future. But that also brings a lot of opportunities to explore. How do we animate the city centre, rethink Princes Street, and what are the other policies that we need to put in place in order to protect our greatest asset? That vibrant city centre that it's a bit of my hobby horse, really. I feel that we really need to think very carefully about our city centre. It's that vibrant nightlife, the retail, that purpose to come and visit, to gather, to meet friends, to enjoy the culture and all the things that our city centre's got to offer. And it's the thing that attracts talent, attracts investment, attracts visitors and also entrepreneurs to set up businesses here and create jobs. So our city centre, is the heart of Edinburgh, and I don't think we can be complacent about its future. I think there are a lot of things that we need to consider. Maybe some things to counteract the out-of-town shopping, maybe transactional tax. Maybe we need free parking at weekends. I can see Paul blanching at the thought of that. But I think, there are things that we need to think about, the transport connectivity and how we encourage a return back to office working in the city centre. So I think there's much to discuss. I'm looking forward to hearing from the panel. And delighted that I can hand over to our guest chair, Louise Masson, the General Manager of Harvey Nichols, who's going to keep the conversation going and keep our panellists in order. please contribute throughout. Add your thoughts through the chat or the Q&A. This is your opportunity to contribute and help shape the future of our city. So if I can just hand over to Louise now, and I will put myself on mute.
Lovely, thank you, Liz, and lots of things that really are exciting from a city centre. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Chamber event. Today, obviously, we are discussing the regeneration of the High Street. And as Liz said, I'm General Manager of Harvey Nichols in Edinburgh. I know many of you, and I've met many of you through a lot of these events. So I thought I'd just give you a little bit of my background in terms of today, because I have worked in retail all my career. Having graduated in Aberdeen, we were sort of talking about John Lewis earlier, and we were sort of saying Roddy's an Aberdonian at heart, and so am I. So I started my career as in Miss Selfridge, and I also have worked for George at Asda. I've managed Fraser's in the city in Edinburgh and Jenner's in the city. So that is quite an exciting thing to see some of the regeneration that might happen for both of those buildings at some point in time. Now I'm lucky enough to be with Harvey Nichols, certainly initially in the Bristol store, and now in our beautiful store in Edinburgh. I can't wait to get opened. I think the team are super excited, and we're really looking forward to welcoming everybody back into the store. Initially, it's great that we can open with hospitality too, so we'll get our 4th floor restaurant and bar opened. The bar obviously serving drinks inside, non-alcoholic, but we will be opening the terrace, hopefully allowing people, if the weather is not too inclement, to allow them to have a cocktail or a glass of champagne outside. I'm also part of the Edinburgh Resilience Group, which was headed up by the Chamber, and the key things that the task force groups have been discussing there are innovation, infrastructure and investment, business support, City of Culture and festivals, tourism, and employability, which is the group that I sit on. And within employability, we are looking at various things, specifically asking questions like who is responsible for reskilling and upskilling within the city, and how we get that connectivity between different workforce with training establishments, etc. Incentives and support for businesses to support individuals and what they need to do to reskill or upskill. And we've recognised that business does need support, investment and innovation to be able to grow and scale their businesses to create jobs. So we need the right workforce to fill the jobs with the right skills. And they're the key things that we're looking at in the employability group. Today, however, as Liz has articulated, we are talking about our city centres and the regeneration of the High Street, and we've some exciting things happening already that Liz has portrayed to. I'm really excited about seeing the change in the West End with the Fraser's building having been transformed into the Johnny Walker Experience, hopefully getting up to that rooftop bar and sitting with a lovely dram or two overlooking the castle. We've talked about the St James already. That will be a fantastic addition to the city centre, and the inclusion of retail, hospitality with the W Hotel and Everyman Cinema. And I think the St James have been really clear about the inclusivity within the whole of the city centre, and have been working with many businesses, the Edinburgh, Essential Edinburgh that Roddy's chief exec of, and the council, to ensure that the landscape of the whole city centre comes together. However, we can't deny that the last year has been one of the most challenging for many of the businesses within the city and for many cities, and the landscape of our cities is changing. Offices will be different. I know that many are talking about a blended approach. Retail, we've seen the closure of many businesses across our city, and we were talking about John Lewis earlier. Having started my career in Aberdeen, that's an iconic building we were saying that will be sadly missed. And John Lewis have announced obviously 8 further closures, and that's mainly due to the online growth. And they cited 70% plus of their business will be online in the coming years. And I think the pandemic has really accelerated the pace of change. And I think that's the key thing here, and allowed businesses to innovate and change the way they work. And as we re-emerge from the pandemic, this will create a lot of opportunity. I think Liz has identified that. And how we take these opportunities will really be key. So I'm certainly looking forward to hearing from the panel today. So I'm going to pass over to them each to introduce themselves, and then we will continue on with the questions. So Tim, can I ask you to introduce yourself first?
Good morning, everybody. I'm Tim Vaughn, Chief Executive of Moorgarth Group. We are the owners of the Waverley Mall shopping centre next door to Waverley Station. Bit of background on our group. We're a South African funded property company and asset manager. We've basically got 3 parts to our business. We have the property company, which we've grown from 8 million up to 250 million over the last 15 years, and that's got a 150 million development pipeline within it. So we both asset manage and own those properties. We've got a property management company, which we call PM&U, that does our own property management as well as management for third parties. And we also own a flexible working business called the Boutique Workplace. That is currently based in central London with about 4,500 workstations currently out of 30 sites. And to be frank, we've learned an enormous amount from a flexible working office operator, because what they do seems to be morphing into the retail landscape as well, with a sort of all-inclusive offer for our retailers. So we've learned quite a lot from them. In terms of the assets that we own, we're about 50% exposed to retail and leisure. The rest is offices. But what we have done typically is buy tired old assets, and hopefully you will appreciate that Waverley Mall is certainly one of those, and then look at repurposing those assets to bring them up to have particular relevance. So we are a Revo Gold Award winner for one of the schemes that we did in Bolton in North Manchester, which was a listed building, grade 2 listed building, where we put in new restaurants. We put a significant amount of community within those, and we brought in a cinema as well. And we also own assets in Reading and the like. But the key thing is that transformatory side of it is changing the reasons people are going to visit, because the world, like we said earlier, is a very, very different place. So we have very much focused on the community aspects of all of our schemes. And what we found pre-COVID was that was bearing fruit in terms of the footfall that was coming to our scheme. So using Waverley as an example, that was at about 15% increase in footfall year on year, when your national average is down 3 to 4%. So that is all part of the sort of engagement and the key thing that we think is really transforming the high street at the moment. But yeah, that's us in a nutshell.
Great, thank you very much, Tim. Paul is Executive Director of Edinburgh City Council. I know that many of you will know Paul already, but Paul, I don't know if you'd like to introduce yourself as well to any that don't know you.
Yeah, happy to, Louise. Morning, everybody. As Louise says, my name's Paul Lawrence. I'm the Executive Director for Place at the City of Edinburgh Council. Some people don't always understand some of the titles we use in local government. Basically, it means I'm responsible for city development. So that's planning, transport, housing, economic development, and also the environmental management of the city. So all our favourite subjects, waste and cleansing, roads management and so on. But also extremely importantly in this context, I think, the cultural life of the city. So we obviously manage many of our own cultural facilities, the assembly rooms, the Usher Hall, City Arts Centre and so on, but also support the festival community, which we're busy trying to do very hard just at the moment. Sometimes I feel, Louise, a bit like a tired old asset, as Tim was talking about. It's certainly been a tough old year, but obviously myself and my team in support of the elected members of the council are, right in the thick of all the questions that you and Liz have raised. We're obviously very involved in the development of St James's Quarter, in the wider city centre transformation projects, and in individual schemes like George Street and so on, return of the festivals, working with Roddy to make sure that we can animate the city and support the hospitality sector when it reopens. So we're right in the thick of this agenda, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the debate, and very happy to share views on any subjects that people have got.
Great, lovely. Thank you very much, Paul. And Roddy is Chief Executive of Essential Edinburgh. I'm sure many of you will know Roddy. He's a regular on these panels as well. So Roddy, over to you.
Morning, everyone. Just a quick bit about Essential Edinburgh. We represent, at the moment, about 550 businesses in the city centre. That'll go up to nearly 650 when St James opens. And over 70% of those are in the retail and hospitality sector. So we're obviously, we're here to support our members, and we do that in a number of ways. But in terms of today's discussion, I think it's already been said that the pandemic has accelerated the change we all knew was going to happen in city centres. This isn't an Edinburgh issue, it's a global issue because of online and various other things. When I started this job 5 years ago, if you walked along Princes Street from west to east, you had the House of Fraser, Debenhams, BHS, Jenner's and Topshop, Top Man. They've all gone now or about to go. But the real positive for Edinburgh, more than other places, is all those buildings have been redeveloped, are being redeveloped just now, or will be redeveloped, which is an enviable position. So I sit here optimistic about the future. There's a number of things we have to do to make sure we keep up with the change and we allow significant change to happen in the city centre. But we have the tools and the assets here to make it happen. We just need the goodwill and some joined up thinking across developers, the council, and our public as well, to make that change happen. But as soon as we do reopen, our priority is really going to be to animate and get people back in the city centre. As we all know, this last year has been hellish for everyone. The city centres have suffered more than most. So really our job in the next months is going to be to get people back into the city centre, to re-engage, to get used to coming into the city centre, to shop, eat and drink. And that's going to be a challenge, but one we're certainly up for. Look forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you very much, Roddy. And actually, you really touched on a point that, we have one of the most beautiful streets in the world in Princes Street. And I think what's really exciting is the potential of that and the regeneration of that. It could be absolutely will be world class. I've no doubt it will be. Which leads nicely on to Paul. We've a question really just for you to sort of give us some information on. The city centre transformation did receive over 3,000 responses to the consultation in 2018. So what work is the council currently doing as a result of the consultation? What is the vision for the Edinburgh city centre as it stands?
Thanks, Louise. So colleagues will be aware that we pushed out this project pre-pandemic, and which seems like a lifetime ago, as Roddy said. And I suppose really trying to get ahead of that question, which Roddy just posed, and which you have as well, Louise, which is what do we want the city centre to be like in the future? Do we basically want it to be what it's been like in the past? And that we try our best to replace, for example, lost retailers like for like? Or do we need to take a kind of new look at how people use the city centre? And what we really tried to do in that project is take a kind of sustainable development approach. And the sustainable development approach has kind of three legs to it. It has the economic side. What are the economic drivers at play? It has the social side. How do we see the city centre as a social entity? And the environmental side. How can we address the environmental footprint of the city centre? Obviously, that's all against a backdrop of a commitment for a net zero carbon city by 2030. So we looked at those three dimensions together, which is absolutely critical in any kind of urban development. And for me, with an economic development background, you can imagine that the economic side was absolutely at the forefront of that. We produced effectively a vision document, which many of you will seen, again, pre-pandemic, huge amount of consultation, which kind of set out what we thought a future vision should be like, and then set a series of projects in train to try and deliver that. And I suppose the most obvious example, Louise, of pushing towards delivery now is the George Street project. And many colleagues will have seen the details of the George Street scheme, and maybe hopefully will have responded to the consultation on that. I'm obviously aware of raging debates on things like street trees and so on, and we're looking forward to receiving all those views and then pushing ahead to finalise the scheme, get the necessary legal orders in place and deliver it as early as possible. I suppose for me, Louise, there are kind of two dimensions of that which have guided our thinking. And as it were, one is about hardware and one is about software, if I can put it like that. And by the way, I completely agree with Roddy's optimism in what Diageo are doing in the Fraser's building, in what Naveen are doing at the St. James Quarter, in what all sorts of investors are doing right across the city. You know, Edinburgh is in extreme, and never mind, for example, what Tim's plans are, for example, at Waverley Mall. Edinburgh is extremely well positioned for our key buildings and institutions to go for an amazing phase of renewal. There are very, very few other cities in a stronger position as us. Now, that's not to be complacent. It is to be optimistic and hopeful. So I think, you know, we're coming from a position of strength. But for me, there's that question of hardware and software. And if I can put the hardware question, that's, I suppose, about the environment of the city centre. And that was uppermost in our minds when thinking about George Street, for example, that there is a lot of car parking on George Street. In my personal view, and I think in the views of many of our consultees, the view was that we're going to get a brand new state-of-the-art, well-covered multi-storey car park as part of the Edinburgh St. James project. Do we really need and want that amount of on-street car parking to dominate, as you say, Louise, what is one of Europe's great streets? Most of Europe's great streets are not car-dominated environments. And we've taken the view that effectively to create that boulevard feel at George Street is the right approach. And as I say, we're on with the moving forward, the process about that. Liz introduced us all to the idea of Princes Street. And we all know, and Jan Gale looked at this, you know, over a decade ago now, you know, Princes Street is a bus-dominated street. In some ways, that's a good thing. It delivers many, many customers and passengers right outside the front door to the places where they need to be. But in environmental terms, the hardware of that street is a difficult one to see being fit for the future. So in city centre transformation, we set out a vision for both a kind of strategy and a network of streets to understand how movement and the quality of our spaces, the physical quality of our spaces, could be dramatically improved around the university at Lauriston Place, through the Bridges corridor at Lothian Road, on Princes Street, on George Street, and then moving across the wider city centre, of course, the Royal Mile itself. So we set out a bold vision to modernise the hardware, the environment of the city centre. And I think that's in keeping with what the greatest cities around the world are doing. The other dimension of that is the content, the software, which is what's going to fill those spaces in the future. And, you know, Tim's probably much more of an expert on this than me. And the key question for me on this is, who are the occupiers of the future? And how can we make sure their occupation of our buildings is in environments they want to be in, exciting environments they want to be in, and on terms they can afford? And for me, that goes to that question of how can we support independent entrepreneurs, particularly in the hospitality sector in the city. We have, in my opinion, some of the greatest food and drink independent entrepreneurs in the UK, if not the world. And for me, the future of an awful lot of the occupation of those premises that Tim's developing, that many others are, is going to be based on demand from those independent entrepreneurs. And we've seen through the pandemic that many of the multiples are rowing back on their portfolios. As I say, Tim's more of an expert on that than me, but I think we see surging demand from the independent sector. So what kind of environments do those independents want to be in? How can we create the best possible environment? And how can we work as a council with property owners, with developers, to make sure the terms that those independents occupy on can be acceptable and kind of take advantage of that entrepreneurial enthusiasm we have in the city. So I think city centre transformation tried to set out both, if you like, the physical vision for the future, moving forward to delivery, and doing that against the context of the kind of content we see the city really being open to us over the next decade. It's incredibly exciting. To echo Roddy's point, the critical thing is that we all work together in partnership to try and make it happen. Thanks, Louise.
Great, thank you for that, Paul, and apologies, I don't know if anybody noticed, I did drop off for a second. I have had technical issues already this morning, so I am back, but I didn't miss much of that, Paul, so thank you very much. It was very, very informative. So Tim, it moves quite nicely on in terms of the role that you believe shopping centres and multi-purpose spaces have to play in regenerating the high street. And what part do you feel Waverley Mall has to play in the regeneration of Edinburgh city centre, and particularly that beautiful street that we have of Princes Street?
Yeah, thank you. Well, the starting point, I think, is that the world has changed phenomenally in the last 12 months. So culturally, mentally, requirements-wise, it is a totally different place than it was even 12 months ago. And we all knew that it was going to be changing quickly. But fundamentally, the online sales will grow. But I mean, the experts and the statisticians are telling us that we might get to between 25 and 30% in terms of total sales on retail coming online. The historic trend was about 19%. So that leaves still between 70 and 75% that will be bricks and mortar retail. So that means that there is going to be a long-term demand for retail spaces, but those retail spaces are going to change. The layout of the stores will have to change. The fact that they'll have to be more engaging with their customers, they're going to have to create experiential facilities where, I mean, talking other retailers, the likes of Primark, they're putting hairdressers in, they're putting coffee shops in, they're putting beauticians in, and that's a Primark. So obviously Harvey Nicks have already done that and been doing that for a number of years. But I think the retail world has just been very slow in catching up with what the demands of the market are. What we have seen, and we referred to the 20-minute city, is that localization, the importance of having a relevance to its community. And I think that's one thing that perhaps Edinburgh could focus on a little bit more from our experiences, their indigenous demand. The people that live and work in the city are an absolute vital bread and butter income for Edinburgh city centre. It's an amazing tourism location, obviously, but tourism may well change. So the stats at the moment is 25% local community, 25% commuters, 25% domestic tourism, and then 25% international tourism. The people are telling us that international tourism probably won't get back to the same levels, if they ever do, until 2023 at the earliest. So there is going to be a massive, in our view, a massive influx of domestic tourism. And then we've got to get those people back who live and work in Edinburgh back into those town centres. And that's all about repurposing the facilities that we have. So like Paul mentioned, how on earth can we attract businesses to come back into the town centre? I was listening to Nationwide Building Society this morning, who were saying that they reckon only 50% of their staff will want to work in a city centre, in a town centre, in an office building again. So what we've got to do is to work with businesses to get them back into the town centre, to create an environment that actually people want to be in and be entertained. So culturally, people are wanting instant gratification. We need to provide that excitement and that experience when they come into the city. And I'll come on to what we're doing in a second, but it's all about convenience. They're wanting it there. They're wanting it immediately. So how can we provide these things which are accessible, convenient, of quality, and have a local relevance to the community itself? And I do think the domestic tourism and international tourism will really embrace that sense of community when they come in to the city as well. Collaboration and sharing, that's a really important part of what we do as a business. So we secured the planning consent that we got on our roof through very open collaboration with Paul and his team, with the planning team, with the local politicians explaining what we were doing and why we were doing them. But our focus is to have relevance to Scotland, to have relevance to the location. Our location is your entry point into the city of Edinburgh. It's not good at the moment. It's not good in part because of the facility that we have currently in Waverley Mall, but that will change. So the scheme that we have, which I've got a picture strategically placed behind me, is for a new deck on the roof of the current mall, which gives a very important prominence onto Princes Street itself. The issue with Waverley Mall has always had is you can't see it, it's a bunker. So people just bypass it. It's a bit of a forgotten opportunity. When it first opened, it was high quality, high value retail and traded extremely well. And then it just seemed to fade away. So we're wanting to reintroduce that quality in this 150% location. But in the front of that, there'll be a large piazza area that we can use for occasional markets, for events, and it will be a meeting space. It will be a communal space for people to come to. They will come to our scheme for different reasons. We're wanting to be a focal point for Edinburgh city centre. What we've also done already with the existing facility, we have funded a number of local businesses to help them set up and trade, because again, one of the difficulties with the city centres is they are very expensive. Setup costs are expensive. So we did the Williams and Johnson's coffee shop. We funded that as an owner. They went in on an all-inclusive turnover base and they traded very well. Obviously it disappeared just as COVID came in. Then we got Bros Bagels and we're about to put Linton Coffee in very shortly. It's repurposing the existing retail that we have. We're also looking at more of a sort of culture aspect. So we've started to bring in more music facilities in the shopping centre as well. Again, it's all about Scottish music. So we have the Scottish Music Experience that have taken a relatively small unit, but it's a different reason to come to our scheme. We've got Avalanche that are selling sort of old historic albums, but again, with a focus on Scottish music. So the Scottish Music Facility is part funded by well-known musicians. Jim Kerr, Simple Minds, and a number of others are all part of that. And that's raising that profile of what we have for a totally different purpose. So we become destinational, not because of our shop, but because of that broad range of assets and facilities that we have within the scheme. Yes, we need to provide the convenience. Yes, we need to provide the food. Yes, we are a travel hub. So Waverley Station currently has 29 million people. This had 29 million people pre-COVID. That's anticipated to increase to 48 million in the next 20 years. So we are a funnel onto the main street of Edinburgh, and we must transform that facility to increase its quality, to still provide that convenience, to still provide that connection to the community, but really significantly grow that. But more importantly, move away from pure retail and give it much more of a connection to that, to the community, to the culture, particularly music, which we're seeing is just an incredibly strong aspect, which they've done incredibly well in Glasgow. So the cultural aspects that they brought into Glasgow have been phenomenal. We'd like to really coordinate and bring that into Edinburgh as part of the wider offer, not just within Waverley Mall. So I would like to think that once we're out of this COVID mess that we're in at the moment, that we can push forward with our scheme on the roof. We can have an entry point into the city which people are really proud of, and we can offer a focal point for both the local community, but one that people will gravitate to when they're visiting Edinburgh as a centre point for the festival season. So that with a relatively small asset, it being in such a strong location, we can create that meeting point, that social point, and complement the other offers that currently sit within Edinburgh as a whole, which are without doubt just phenomenal. I mean, Edinburgh is the second largest visitor attraction in the UK outside London. So what a great opportunity that is for us to grow. But as I mentioned at the beginning, I think the indigenous people of Edinburgh and the commuters into Edinburgh can be engaged more and brought back into the city and bring some relevance as well.
Great, thank you very much, Tim. Really fascinating insight into the plans, and also really is very exciting from a city perspective in terms of the regeneration of several areas within the city centre. And I think that's, you know, really exciting to hear how, and it is interesting how experiential has become the key thing. And certainly, you know, mentioned Harvey Nichols have done it for several years, but it is absolutely, you know, what most customers are coming in to do. And, you know, coming into shop, go for a lunch, then go for maybe another bit of shop, pop to the cinema, come back, have a cocktail. And I think that is definitely critical in terms of how we get our cities really working. It's interesting also how you talked about the office and how we re-engage offices to bring their people back in or get a blended approach. And I think it is about, you know, that is part and parcel of what makes Edinburgh, is our local communities, our office workers. And we know that certainly from our store, that's really important to us as well. So Roddy, also an area for us to think about is George Street, which we've talked about a little bit already today, and has reportedly had some retail, restaurants and office space with to-let signs outside them. But you recently spoke around making these spaces into festival venues for the summer. And what creative things have we been thinking about, and solutions are you suggesting that we use the space for longer term and all year round?
Okay, just put that into some sort of context and to react to a few things Paul and Tim have said. Paul's absolutely right. You know, we need people to come into the city and we want them to stay. So that means they need to shop, eat, drink and be entertained for as long as we possibly can. Now that's nothing new, and that's what we've been trying to do for a long time. But the world is changing. St. James, the St. James Quarter is going to be the best thing that's happened to Edinburgh for a long time. It's a huge opportunity, but it is also a threat to the rest of the city centre, because people are going to come in, they're going to park the car there, and they're going to go there initially. We need to make the rest of the city centre an attractive place to get them out of St. James, and the city is going to be hopefully big enough for both of them to survive, and it will. But for that to happen, I think we need to look long and hard at how we use the space that we have available. And it is going to be mixed use. It's going to be retail, hospitality, accommodation, both private and hotels, office space, and potentially music, arts, entertainment venues to get people in. And to me, to do that, we need a number of things. We need some flexibility in planning. And to Paul and his colleagues' credit, the council have moved on that. I think they may have to move a bit further down the line. We need to have ambition and not be scared of taking a few risks with a few of the buildings. That's obviously harder in Edinburgh than other places because we live in the middle of a World Heritage site. And we all know there have been a few examples of heritage lobbies lobbying hard to get or not to get change when potentially change is a great opportunity. So I think that if we can take all those on board, then as we said at the start, most of Edinburgh city centre is owned by pension funds and large institutions. If things are empty, then their assets not getting sweated, as they say. So they want to do things in order to generate some money. Some of the other things I think we need to do, business rates is a huge one. One of the biggest barriers to people coming onto George Street and Princess Street is business rates. They are extortionate. I think we need to have a review to at least have a level playing field. If you've got the same amount of space on Princess Street, you shouldn't be paying too much more than you are if you're in the Gyle, Fort Kinnaird, Hermiston Gate or Straighton or in St James. That needs looked at to give opportunities for the independent businesses to come in and not be hindered too much. And we've touched on tourism. This is a bit of a bugbear of mine. I think 4 million tourists is a lot of people to sustain Edinburgh. And a lot of the growth in the city centre in the last few years has been on the back of tourism. If you just look at all the new fancy hotels and bars and restaurants, yes, they're there to service people like you and I who live in the city, but they're also there to service our tourists. We need to go out and push hard. As Tim said, international tourists aren't coming back anytime soon, but they will return. And when we are open for business, we need to make sure that Edinburgh is at the top of search engines, at the top of queues. It's being promoted widely to people around the world. Yes, we need people from the Far East and North America who are high spending visitors, but we also need European colleagues to get back into the city. And that's something we need to push hard. And that will need lobbying from all sorts of sectors. If we do anything to hinder our tourism numbers in the long run, it makes absolutely no economic sense. It's illogical, dangerous, and foolhardy at the least. So certainly from my point of view, and coming on to the question I was asked, in terms of some of the empty units in the city, there is an opportunity to use them on a short-term basis. Obviously, people are going to want to let them out, but they're better being used than be emptied. And for that, I think certainly during festival season, there's a chance for entertainment venues, pop-ups, whether it's arts exhibitions, restaurants. We don't want empty units in the city centre. I'd much rather they're used on a short-term basis to animate the city and not have hoardings up. And certainly I've had some chats with some of the festival providers about potentially using some of the buildings. And there are a few iconic buildings that will be empty, which could be great to use in the short term, while hopefully we're doing everything we can to sell them for long-term development.
Great. And actually that's really interesting because, you know, how we do events will be really important through the summer, and having big space might be really an excellent opportunity to actually use those spaces and manage to, if we have to socially distance, and create those spaces to actually utilize and get some festival opportunities going. So that sounds very exciting. I suppose this opens up to all of the panel. We have had some questions coming in, and Emma, I had some questions in the chat before I was dropped off, so maybe I'll need you to help me just to facilitate that. But one of the things that really just want to sort of ask is, how can the council and key decision makers involve businesses and citizens across the city to help with the decision-making process around regenerating the high street? And how can we facilitate a more collaborative approach? I know we've been trying to do that with the George Street, and I know, Paul, you mentioned, you know, have we all actually engaged with that consultation process, etc. But what are your thoughts, panel? Paul, I don't know if you want to come in first.
Yeah, I'm happy to, Louise. I mean,
Great.
to be honest, I think in Edinburgh we have a very strong engagement, both from communities, often via community councils, amenity associations and so on, and from the business community, often led by Liz and her colleagues, but also through the Federation of Small Business and many others as well. So there's rarely a day goes by without myself and my team hearing, I'm sure Roddy's the same, without hearing from either what you might call representatives of civic society or representatives of the business community. So I think, you know, I hope people feel there's a really strong chance to have their voices heard, that those voices are listened to. You know, obviously we have lively and ongoing debates in the city, and Roddy's referred to one or two of those, but I think that level of engagement in Edinburgh is extremely high. Liz has often used the phrase Team Edinburgh, and how we can make sure that key stakeholders, the university is a great example of this, who we work really closely with, as you can imagine, that Team Edinburgh is, as it were, representing a kind of single front and sending consistently strong messages out, both across the country, but also internationally. I think that's probably a bit more work we can do, Louise, to really kind of build that Team Edinburgh proposition. But for the council, it's really important that we are an open organisation, that people feel they can talk to us. Sessions like this are very important. I speak to the Scottish Property Federation regularly. I was on a call with the Edinburgh Association of Community Councils the other week. The key thing is for the council, not only officials like myself, but elected members as well, people can be approachable, and that level of engagement is strong. I think that's the case, but I think maybe we could do a bit more, particularly post-pandemic, to really build that consistent Team Edinburgh approach. But I think, again, we start from a really strong position.
Yeah, and I think it is really interesting that often on the chamber, and certainly as a member of the chamber, we do see quite a lot of council updates and communication via Liz, which is really helpful. I don't know if Roddy, you would like to add anything to that?
I just back Paul up. I think the consultation process is always very extensive, and the council do listen. I do think that one of our main strengths in the city is our heritage, but it's also one of our main weaknesses, because I think things get slowed down and get overthought, overanalyzed, and potentially over-consulted, and potentially things are skewed. So I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying it's something that the council probably need to look at, as do all the businesses, because I think for real change to be needed, then real change is going to have to happen, and we've made some massive steps forward in the last while. But as I say, I think we may need to go a bit further.
Okay, Tim, I don't know if you've got anything to add in terms of how you worked with the council when you were talking about the centre, the mall, and what you were doing.
No, I'm not just saying this because Paul's on the line, but we had a really good open discussion with Paul and his team. We always had some sensible meetings. We as a business sort of try and be very open about what our objectives are for the scheme. So before we buy anything, we always have an idea on what we're going to do to it. And then we went and spoke to the council about our ambitions, and they were very supportive. Obviously, we secured the planning permission for it. So we found the council very accessible. I think there's a lot of political factions that you also have to talk through. There's a lot of heritage in Edinburgh, and that has to be protected. And a little bit like Roddy's just said, sometimes that I do sense that can hold back the city. Edinburgh needs to be a truly European city and be seen as being very modern and forward thinking, and you need to be attracting sort of tech businesses and young, energetic, quality people into the city. And we need to think long and hard about how you do that, because they aren't necessarily going to look backwards at their heritage. They're going to be wanting to look forward to being in an exciting, vibrant city that gives them that instant gratification that I was talking about earlier, but gives them that live-work balance, which I think people of my generation probably didn't get in the right balance. Whereas what we're seeing nowadays is a significant focus on leisure time rather than work. So you really are finding that people are working to live now rather than the other way around. And I think Edinburgh has so many positive elements to it, but the constraints of some of its heritage, we need to find a sort of clever solution for. But I do think it's just got a massive opportunity to grow and attract quality staff. But that will really help the sustainability of the city going forward, is to find that USP that really gets those quality jobs back into the town centre. Stop all this silly out of town development. Stop putting people out in business parks and thousands of jobs for people that sit and eat their own sandwiches at lunchtime. You want people that come into the city, walk the city streets and spend their money at lunchtime and in the evenings, and then you've started to create a proper 24-hour city.
That really is interesting as well, in the sense I have a friend that actually jumps on the tram from one of the out of towns to come and meet me for lunch sometimes, and then hops back on the tram to go back to work. But it's about making all that connectivity much simpler as well. Paul, I wonder if there is, and this is an interesting one, and heritage is a key thing. Roddy's mentioned it and Tim's mentioned it. So how do we, maintain the cultural heritage of the city and the beautiful structures that we have, but become that innovative and forward-thinking city as well?
I mean, I must admit, Louise, I'd take a slightly different view, I suppose, from Roddy and Tim. I mean, I think quality of place and distinctiveness are major urban assets. The greatest cities in the world, the ones you want to go and visit, the ones you want to live in, are A, the most beautiful, and B, the most distinctive. Edinburgh World Heritage did a really interesting piece of work, I think before Adam Wilkinson left, which looked at distinctiveness as a key competitive advantage. And that's what our heritage gives us. Louise, you've seen during lockdown, people talking about the quality of place that we have in Edinburgh, the amount of people in Arthur's Seat and in Holyrood, both during the day and at weekends, people at the Meadows and so on, enjoying the natural environment and the built environment. Those are economic advantages as well as heritage assets. They can help power the city forward and give it the distinctive edge that, frankly, places that look like they're anywhere in the world don't have. So I think that sense of place, that real strength of local distinctiveness, is a huge economic advantage. Of course, there will always be arguments about preserve this and not do this there and so on. But we must see heritage as an asset, not a threat. And I think there's a lot to do. Anybody in the heritage community will say we've got a Royal Mile action plan that we've still got an awful lot of work to do on, but we've done a huge amount. Donald Anderson, the former leader of the council, says this all the time, that actually the way to make the most of our heritage is to make sure all those assets are really well used, whether it's from a commercial perspective or a public perspective. So, I think people, and particularly young people in a tech sector, as Tim says, which Edinburgh, I think, is the third strongest in the UK now, and continues to grow, partly thanks to the City Region deal and the Data-Driven Innovation Initiative, partly thanks to institutions like Codebase, partly thanks to the kind of rapid growth of many of our tech startups. They want an area, they want a sense of identity and places and spaces that they can feel belong to them. We have that in spades. We just need to kind of make more of it, improve it. That's why, for example, that focus on the area around Tevia, around Lauriston Place, Fountain Bridge and so on, we can do so much more there. So I think that kind of forward-looking agenda and seeing heritage as an asset, that's really, really strong for Edinburgh.
Yeah, and I know I certainly was on the quarter mile presentation that the Chamber had facilitated, and that was fascinating to see how the change of that building will really sort of be quite innovative and inclusive of many. So
yeah, that's another game changer, Louise. I mean, Roddy, I think you talked about the Johnny Walker Centre. Roddy talked about Edinburgh St James, the St James Quarter being a game changer. What the university are doing with the former hospital site is going to be another game changer in that part of the city. So we've got these kind of big game changers that really make me positive for the future.
Great. Pamela Hall, I think you raised your hand. I don't know if you still would like to speak.
Sorry, I didn't mean to raise my hand.
Okay, no worries.
No, I think I was trying to do like applause, because I really agree with what Paul was saying about that distinctiveness of place being a huge asset for the city. I couldn't agree more.
Great. And I think it's been really fabulous that actually as green space, we have got amazing green space. And, I walk with my niece quite a lot, who's at university here. And, we were saying that we are so privileged to live in such a wonderful city. I think we have to all recognise that. Professor Joe, you have your hand raised.
Thanks, Louise, and thank you, panel, for a fascinating discussion, an overview of our beautiful, inspiring city. My question is, what effect do you think Brexit has had and will have in terms of trading on our high streets? And secondly, there are many neighborhood organizations, associations who desire for our festivals to be moved almost out with our city to stadium parking lots, etc. If this happens, Paul and others, how do we keep our city animated in the future? Because one of the exciting elements of our city, as someone mentioned about Dublin, is the concentration of animation in the city center. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on those two questions.
Lovely, thank you, Joe. Tim, can I come to you first, please? That'd be great.
Yeah, thanks very much, Joe. Well, early days on Brexit, obviously. It's very difficult to comment on that question without showing your own personal bias, but I mean, it throws a lot of challenges for the UK. I think Edinburgh is, as Paul said, in a unique position, and Scotland actually in more of a unique position to fight against the challenges. I think it sets itself apart from Brexit. It can embrace Europe in a different way than England can. I think tourism-wise, like we were speaking about, getting European tourism into Edinburgh, I think will be a very strong case. But Edinburgh is a European city. It's regarded as a strong European city. It's not a big place, but I still think it's a very strong European city with a massive profile, and obviously heritage, history is key. In terms of your second question on the festival, you've already heard my views on out-of-town retail and business parks and the like, and I think putting the festival out of town, when you look at the income it generates for the city centre as a whole, is phenomenal. As soon as you push it out of town, you'll get people driving in and driving away again without spending a penny in the city centre. It's absolutely imperative from my perspective. Again, I would say it because I've got an asset that sits right in the middle of it. But wow, the benefits that we see in terms of footfall coming into the city centre and the spend that we have in our little scheme and the activity that we're creating on the roof, that just wouldn't exist. And I think it's absolutely imperative that it stays within the city centre, because it needs to consolidate to mass. You know, the more consolidation, the stronger the event becomes. So yeah, I'm a massive fan of keeping it focused in the city centre, because that's where you've got all those wonderful things to sell. You haven't got it in a parking lot next to a football stadium.
Great, thank you very much. Roddy, or would you?
Yeah, I'll come in. In terms of Brexit, Tim's right, it's early days yet, but I can think of probably three things. One, I think probably just visitor sentiment. I think unfortunately we're probably not looked on quite as lovingly as we were a while ago. All the indications are that's not going to impact European visitor numbers, but let's hope not. Second issue is workforce. I think a lot of the hospitality industry has lost some of its workforce from Europeans who have gone home. And the third one that's affected a lot of our top-end retailers, Louise, as you know, is some of the tax-free shopping issues that are a direct issue coming out of Brexit, that it's going to be easier for tourists to spend the money in Paris and Berlin and Madrid than it is to spend it in Edinburgh, which is not going to help on tourists coming back. I also agree with Tim in terms of out of town. I have no issue with some of festivals being moved around the city, but the key thing is the festival promoters and the acts don't want to move out of the city. You know, the city centre is where it's at. You can do lots of things. You can see 5 or 6 shows in a day. You can eat, drink, spend time in the gardens. You can enjoy yourself. And, you know, we have to address some of the issues in terms of the city being exceptionally busy for 2 or 3 weeks of the year. They can be solved by moving some things out, but the festival is something that is always going to take part in the new town and the old town, in my opinion.
Great, thank you. And Paul?
Just to add briefly on Brexit, Louise, all I would say is that, to emphasise what I said before, really, for me, the universities are absolutely key assets. And never mind Scottish universities, British universities have been magnets for international talent, both to come and study in great cities like Edinburgh, but also to stay here. And if that's impacted at all by Brexit, obviously it would need someone from the higher education community to say rather than me. But that is a concern, both on attraction and retention. And I do think that's something that we need to keep our eyes on. I know colleagues in the University of Edinburgh are concerned about that. On the festivals, I think it's important to differentiate between the here and now and future years. Colleagues might be aware that we are working extremely hard with the festival community to try and see what can be done this summer, because going all the way back to Tim's point and maybe yours, Louise, about giving people reasons to use the city centre again, I think that the festivals can be a core part of that. But clearly this year, COVID security and having maximum amounts of circulation space and so on are important issues. We will not get the green light to host events unless they are safe from a public health perspective, and therefore thinking what places and spaces we might use this year might be slightly different from future years. That doesn't say I'm a particular fan of out of town car park locations, albeit I think there may be occasions when festivals in one-off locations, and I can think of some across the city, might be exciting event arenas. So I think we should think about this year slightly differently, and also think about kind of particular locations on a one-offs as having exciting potential. But broadly, I'm with Tim and Roddy, that sense of festivalness, to invent a word, comes from critical mass and comes from a lot of things happening together. Clearly, as Roddy says, that does bring city management issues, whether that's transport, whether that's the management of cleansing, whether that's pressure on accommodation and so on. But I think we've got increasing tools in the box to try and help with that. And as the festivals recover, hopefully to a kind of new normal, to use that horrible cliche, in 22, 23 onwards, then we will retain that sense of critical mass, but try and address some of the downside issues, which I think have been well rehearsed elsewhere.
Great, excellent, thank you. I think a good time still to open up to questions. There's a couple of things coming through the chat. So would anybody else like to ask a question to the panel? Not at the minute. Okay, well, I will ask one from my perspective, and I suppose we've sort of touched on it already, which is about the 20-minute neighbourhoods ambitions and the impact that might have on the city centre. I know I live in Morningside, and I know that Morningside is busy as it's ever been. But similarly, if you go to Stockbridge and you see the queues outside the coffee shops, etc., and I suppose it's about maintaining that, because it is lovely seeing your local areas thriving, but also really reminding our customers, certainly from Harvey Nichols' perspective, that the city centre is back in action as and when it comes back in. So any thoughts on that, panel?
Just maybe to start, Louise, if that's okay. I mean, you can imagine it's a council issue that we've been taking extremely seriously, and as you say, many of the areas, many of the cities, town centres. You talked about Stockbridge and Morningside, Portobello. Similarly, I'm sure lots of people will have walked up and down Portobello, the front of Portobello, and never seen it quite so busy. So we are fortunate in that Edinburgh already has a series of 20-minute neighbourhoods which work extremely well. And I think there's a lot we can do to support business better on those high streets and in those 20-minute neighbourhoods. And I know some people are not fans of this, but the work we've been trying to do to create more and better space in neighbourhoods, to create more space for people to queue outside shops, but still good circulation space. Again, quality of place is the most important issue. That's what we've been trying to achieve. I think you said right at the beginning, Louise, that all the evidence says that people will go back, and Tim mentioned, I think the nationwide in this context, that people will go back to a blended model. So what we obviously want to try and do is the win-win, is to retain that real sense of strong vibrancy in our local centres, which we had before COVID, we very much have during COVID, and we need to retain afterwards, but blend that with a return to feeling the city centre is safe, is exciting, is dynamic, is a great place to go. And we can do that through many of the initiatives we've talked about this morning. So for me, it's definitely not either or, but we've got work to do to support both.
Great, lovely, thank you. Roddy?
Yeah, Paul's spot on. It's both. It's not an either or, and there's no doubt the city centre has taken a huge hit during the last year with the shop local campaigns and people being at home, because we know there's lots of workers coming to the city. The one interesting thing for me going forward over the next few years will be if the short-term let legislation goes through and there are less need for short-term lets. And I think hopefully one of the outcomes of that will be more people living in the city, in the old and new towns. I also do believe that George Street and the upper floors of Princes Street are ready made for private residential. Hopefully private residential that people will live in, as opposed to second homes or holiday homes. So I think my hope would be over the next few years, you'll get more people living in the city centre. So it does de facto become a 20-minute neighbourhood by itself. But I do have a real fear about the office workforce. And certainly we're promoting officers to get the workforce back in as quickly as it's safely to do so. I don't think anyone anticipates that there'll be 100% of the people who were before, but we certainly need to get that up, well into the 60 and 70%, because these are the people that sustain, you come out the lunch hour and go to Harvey Nichols or Marks and Spencer's or John Lewis and buy a sandwich. And if we don't then have them back in, then it will be a struggle. Great.
Tim, anything to add?
Support Paul and Roddy on that. I think it's a complicated question, but what I'd like to think is that the city centre can bring in more of the Stockbridge and Portobello offers. So, those people that are finding it very comfortable hopping out of their front door and going to their favourite coffee shop, actually you can get an element of that in the centre of the city. Because, I think we all know, you walk around the city centre of Edinburgh, and if you even judge that against London, London is full of independents. If you go in certain areas of London, it's full. There just isn't any independent representation in the core of the city. And I think that is partly because it's too expensive, but there's not right-sized accommodation. And there might be some nervousness from these independents from coming in. And as I mentioned earlier on, we've supported a number of independents coming into our scheme, and they've traded extremely well. I was concerned when Williams and Johnson opened that they sit next to Costa. You can get a bucket of coffee for £2.50 in Costa. You get a really nice cup of coffee that's slightly larger than a thimble for £2.50 out of Williams and Johnson. People went to Williams and Johnson. They like the independence. They like the relevance. And I think if you can get that mix in the core of the city centre, that broadens the attractiveness of the city, as well as other culture aspects as well. I think that's key. But bring in some of those outlying areas of Edinburgh that we all know work incredibly well, bring those into the city centre, and it just brings that eclectic mix that people are really after and brings that localism back into the city.
And that was interesting also with Lana from Bros Bagels did the final speech at the business festival, and actually it was very innovative and very exciting and very really sort of forward thinking. It was great. We have got some hands raised. So Denzel, I think you are wanting to come in.
Hi, morning everyone. My question is really picking up on what Tim has just said about the cost of being a business in the city centre. I think the elephant in the room to some extent is business rates. Scottish Government is very good for the very small units, in that I think if your rateable value is under 15,000, you pay no business rates. But Central Edinburgh has an income of roughly £1 million a year. That is 1% of the total rates paid in the city centre by our members, which is £100 million a year. And I think we need to encourage our elected members, our officials, Paul, our local politicians to really force government to look at this business of business rates very, very seriously, because only that way will we have sustainable businesses in city centres.
Great. Who would like to come in
Just
first?
if I could comment on that.
Lovely,
Revo, which is one of the organisations UK-wide, has been lobbying central government about rates and putting forward some suggestions on how it can become a much fairer system. Unfortunately, despite what we were hoping, it just wasn't brought up at the budget review a couple of weeks ago. But there are many, many lobbies now going on about rates. I mean, in the regions in particular, we have situations where the rates payable, is more than the rent that you can achieve from a tenant, which just seems completely nonsensical. So we aren't able to let vacant units in some of our schemes because the rates are so high. I mean, that is just a nonsense. So the Revo team, which I'm part of, have been lobbying that central government and will continue to do that and try and align rates to more business performance rather than this rather archaic system of comparing what's gone on down the road, which just doesn't make any sense at all.
Great. I don't know, Paul, if you would like to.
Oh, well,
yeah,
it's kind of political territory a bit, Louise, to be honest. But all I would add briefly is that in my experience of dealing with central government officials, particularly those in finance ministries, the Treasury and so on, and I think this applies both to the Scottish government and the UK government, is that they're all for reform, but they need to know where the hole's going to be met from. So business rates reform tends to mean certain people will pay less, which from an economic development point of view strikes me as exactly the right thing to do, equals less revenue into the exchequer. So how do you fill the gap? And I'm not sure that many of the cases for reform have properly answered that question to the satisfaction of Treasury and Finance Department officials. I think it's the right drum to bang, if I can call it that. But I think understanding, as it were, what the nature of the gap in income to an exchequer would be and how that could be addressed remains really quite a tricky, as it were, within government issue, if I'm honest.
Yeah, if you look at the largest retailer in Scotland, that being the Amazon warehouse at Dunfermline, they probably did more sales in the last 12 months than the rest of Scotland put together. So perhaps rather than charging them £2 a square foot in rates, they could charge them £10 a square foot, which is still significantly less than a town centre, city centre retail. Then there might be some sort of more fair balance, because I just think it's totally unfair and inequitable at the moment.
Interesting. So thank you for that very much. Roddy, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, or?
Nothing to add, I agree.
Yeah, great. Okay. Any further questions? There's some good things coming through the chat. Certainly, Kelly Wright says that she's agreeing with Paul. We need to retain our heritage. In Edinburgh is a beautiful city, and that's why most people come here. Every high street in the country otherwise looks the same and has same shops, and we have a real opportunity to innovate, to create a platform for innovative commercial businesses that work in harmony with our unique city and create a real point of difference as a shopping experience. Thank you, Kelly, for that. I did see some chat saying that there may be something to learn from European cities, as they are much more 24-hour cities. Dublin, as an example, has is as busy at 3 in the morning as it is at 3 in the afternoon. So maybe changing times. And I know certainly from that, the St James Quarter will be opening from 9 in the morning till 8 p.m. at the initial outlay. So I'm sure Nick and the team there would want us to promote that. Any further questions? I'm conscious, I think we're nearly coming to our summing up time, but any final questions from anyone? I'm not seeing anybody. So can I just say, first of all, thank you very much, panel. The chat has been very good and really enjoyed, and some really good thoughts for us all to think about. I think we are in a unique position in our beautiful city of Edinburgh. There's lots coming, there's lots happening, and there's still lots to talk through. And I think over the next few years, the city will just grow and innovate, with some investment, with some focus on what do we need to keep businesses coming into the city centre. Support from the council, Paul, thank you for all of the feedback. Also, how we continue to work with the Chamber, I think, is really important here, because the Chamber, Essential Edinburgh, are certainly tools for us to use as businesses to hear and have a voice really into the council and how we support that. So I'm going to pass, I think, over, if there's no more further questions, I'm passing back to Emma, who's going to do the final vote of thanks and sum up.
Yeah, thank you, Louise. It's just really to thank everybody for coming along. Thanks again to our panellists, and just to flag that the Chamber's got many more panel events such as this, and we're continuing to do a lot of our networking events, and we'll be throwing some new social events into the mix as well, just to keep us all entertained while we're still in the virtual world for a wee bit longer. So that's everything from us, and just to thank you all again for taking part and for the conversation today, and hopefully see you at another event soon.
Great.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good rest of the day, and we'll speak soon. Take care. Bye-bye.